Greetings and salutations, all you beautiful people, and welcome to another episode of Art of the Beholder, a show dedicated to all things eclectic in the world of art. I'm your host, Novo Day, and today we're going to be talking about art and horror by focusing on famed Japanese horror manga artist Junji Ito. To hash things out, we're once again joined by our favorite spiral, the other ghost with the most, and that is Mr. Philip Church of philipchurch.com. Welcome back, sir.
Ohio gozaimasu?
Ooh.
It's definitely not the morning. I don't know why I said that.
No, it is the morning, because when people hear this, it's the morning.
True. First thing, that's what they do, is they wake up.
So let's lie to everyone, as we always do. Yep, let's lie to everybody. Good morning, all you AOTB lovers
Nothing
out
is
there.
real and time is a construct.
And welcome, because it is spooky season. It is time. It's our favorite time of the year. Me and Philip do this every fucking year.
It's the best.
Because we like talking horror with you guys. We like talking all things spooky. We like talking
best modern genre.
Scary, yes. And today is the day. And we did hint at this many moons ago at our other special when we talked about the top modern masters of horror. Junji was one of those modern masters, even though we had to give a disclaimer. He's been doing this for fucking decades, okay? But we didn't quite fall in love with him here in the West, definitely not in the States, until maybe the last decade ago.
Took a while.
Yeah, it took a while. We'll talk about that. I'm actually excited to talk about that in the juicy middle, the discussion, because I have a question for you.
I love a juicy middle. Yes?
Yep. Yes, we all do. We're Americans. We like hamburgers. Hamburger. But first, Philip, let's tell the good people why we're talking about Mr. Ito today. Well, Junji Ito's horror somehow feels both classical and contemporary at the same time, both grounded and cosmic, elegant and macabre, ultimately writing this very fine line of familiar but strange. So there's something about his work that I can't put exactly my finger on, or my claw on, or my vampire tooth on, but that's why we're going to talk about him today, because there's some special sauce in there, and I can't put my exact finger on it. And we will, knowing Philip and I, we're gonna hash things out, and we're gonna summarize that.
We're gonna hack away at this until we get to the juicy middle,
and we're going to sum it up in our conclusions. But there's something about very addictive about his work. Like I remember reading the very first, or my very first story, my introduction to him, not his literal first story, but the first story I ever read of his, and I immediately wanted more, and the rest there is history. I own half of his short stories. I love his long form. I own a lot of his apparel merch. I'm watching the Adult Swim Uzumaki right now. It's fucking bonkers great. And there's this, there's something about him that makes him not only a modern master of horror, but just an icon in the field.
I think a timelessness is very instilled in his work due to the fact that he is insanely prolific and has produced so much, to where so many topics and aspects of horror, and very atypical aspects of horror, have been covered by him at this point. Because for the longest time in Japan, a lot of horror simply was very, very traditional, just ghosts and certain kinds of demons, or oni, if you will.
Ringu shit,
Well, but even before that, though, for the longest time, of course, it was a very insulated country. Yeah, it was a very insulated country and culture for the longest time. And then even after all the Americanization, and then especially like the Hollywoodization that was happening.
Globalization, for sure.
Yeah, the globalization, and when they started getting things like mummies, Frankenstein, other things that we also consider classic horror, it was just as new to them. It was newer to them than it even was to us. Because, even if you think about it, actual Dracula type stuff is really only like 200-ish years old. Other things like mummies and whatever, Frankenstein, all this stuff, it's not actually that ancient and timeless. So yeah, I think for him, it's just been insanely fun to find the creepy in so much of everyday life
about it.
Yeah, well, and just with the fact that there is something odd about so many things that are technically perfectly natural, and it's got to be so interesting to be able to turn everything on its head, to look for the eeriness, to look at like what would it take for this thing in front of me, like to really creep me out or just make me see it differently. It seems to be how his mind works, because again, some of it has been a bit serialized in the way that we're about to tell you about, like for instance, like Tomie. I like that approach of looking for the mundane and making it absolutely
terrifying.
Just relatively just shaking it up and looking for those angles that aren't just different, of just like, oh, this is kind of weird, but really just being like, this would make me crawl out of my skin. And funny enough, the one of the things that I remember earliest on of his that I read, I don't know whether it was providence or coincidence that I was looking into certain types of stories, but I have claustrophobia. And the one about the Enigma of Amigara Fault.
Oh my God, we're jumping ahead. That was my first.
Yeah,
that was my first read ever.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Very serious.
That's hilarious. That's the first one that really stuck out with me. Yeah. And I have some other fun, slightly tangential stories that will tie into how he's been weirdly prevalent, or things about him have been somewhat prevalent in my life as well. But obviously, being a Japanophile over here, I lived there for a couple months. I studied it for years, so he's not exactly strange to me. But I really like seeing that he's made a name for himself and broken out of just the local Japanese
absolutely
culture.
And we still need to shine a light, especially in the West. More people need to fall in love, much like we have, and they will. It's spooky season.
It continues to happen.
'Tis the season. So there's a lot to discuss. But before we do, of course, we all need a little background. Junji Ito was born on July 31st, 1963 in
Nakatsugawa in Gifu, Japan.
He began drawing manga at the age of 4. He was born to do this. It was destiny, but he didn't get his breakthrough until 1987. So still 1987, guys, think about it. Where are we right now? 2024? Yeah. So almost 40 years. When he submitted a short story to Monthly Halloween, it was given an honorable mention award. That short story ran for 13 years and was later serialized as one of his most prized creations and characters, Tomie, and the rest, as they say, is history. To date, Ito has won a number of awards and accolades, including 4 Eisner Awards and an Inkpot in 2023.
Love the fact that as he had graduated college and was legitimately just a dental tech, that he never gave up, that he continued, he never stopped doing his thing, and that it even took him a while longer to be like, should I just focus on my manga? It's like, dude, you're getting recognition and winning awards and people love your stuff. But he legitimately like never really gave it up, which is just so adorable. So I've always loved that, thinking about the fact that he's just a dude. He loves cats. He's a dental tech, and he just writes horrific shit, writes and draws it himself. He's just such an interesting
seems
guy.
Like the most average-looking guy.
He's so chill. He's so chill.
He just looks like a regular Joe.
He is,
and the stuff that comes out of his head is mind-boggling,
and to the point where sometimes stuff comes out of people's heads. In multiple stories, oftentimes things come out of people's heads. So getting a little bit meta there, but you know what? It's for everybody's benefit, if you ask me.
Guys, we're going to talk all about it here in a minute. Guys, stay with us. We'll be right back.
Support for this show is brought to you by novel Till the Bitter Endemic. What if there was a happy ending to a pandemic? Perhaps an unexpected love story. After Daisy gets thrust into mandatory quarantine for an infection she can't explain, it's up to her to unravel the truth as to what's behind it and what she can ultimately do to escape it. But she can't do this alone, and that's where she finds not only herself, but a very special person that opens their heart for the betterment of their survival. Find out how in Till the Bitter Endemic. Available now on Amazon in all major formats.
Philip, it's time to do the damn thing. And I want to start here. I want to start with first impressions. We already kind of spilled the beans. I was first introduced to Ito with Enigma. But yeah, I want to do a quick history lesson. Let's not spend too much time on this, because we got to talk art, we got to talk work, we got to talk history of said work.
But are these all different topics? What?
Yes, it's in the outline. Look at it right now. Now, before we do that, I thought it would be fun since, again, he's been doing, we would have joked about this. He's been doing this for fucking ages, decades, but a lot of us here in the West didn't quite get into him until relatively recently. So I wanted to hear yours, but I'll give you mine just to give you an opportunity to frame how you want to say it. I got into him about 10 years ago. I want to say it was about 2014. And I remember the very first time I heard his name is because I was really getting into the EDM artist Flying Lotus, or the IDM artist Flying Lotus at this point. And he was trying to commission him from like album art. He kept talking about him. He's one of his favorite artists and all this stuff. It ended up not working out. I think it was a different manga artist that did some of his album art. But that was the very first time I heard that name. And then soon after that, or maybe like at about the same time, we got Hideo Kojima's PT. And it was this marriage of artists making a trailer that changed gaming forever. We talked about this in our other show, our Silent Hill show. I remember Hideo Kojima finally coming out and saying, yeah, this was a collaboration between Guillermo del Toro himself and Junji Ito. Yeah, and Junji Ito. And I was like, who is this guy? And then it was weird. At about the same time, I remember seeing kind of shows like ours, but like, a YouTube format with like, visuals and video, kind of doing like their little pieces on Ito's work. And they were talking about Uzumaki and all this stuff. And they talked about the Enigma. And I was like, I gotta fucking find this thing. So I found it, I read it, and I was hooked immediately. I was like, Jesus. So much like I already joked, to this day, I continue to buy his work. I have probably half of his collections, a lot of his merch, his art book. I will pretty much buy whatever he touches.
Weirdly enough, because I've been such a nerd my whole life, I read some stuff of his in a Barnes & Noble way the hell back. I mean, I was actually a kid still, maybe like a teen or tweenish, but I will never forget that day because I looked through a bunch of horror manga in Barnes & Noble, and coincidentally enough,
as one does,
just Saturday shit. And funny enough, one of the books that also stands out to me from that, like just day in general, outside of reading some of his works, which again also includes the Enigma of Amigara Fault, which again just terrifies the crap out of me because of holes and that are shaped like you.
It's just so creative, though. Like,
it's really fucking cool.
That the hole spoke to the people too.
Yeah, that it like has this
the
insane
exact perfect size and the shape
about
for them.
Yeah, something about seeing your exact hole it has an almost irresistible pull that just like. Bleh. But
that's what makes him different too, is that kind of stuff.
It's a mixture. Yeah, there's the play on claustrophobia, but there's that also the fact that it came out of a fault, so that it's been in the earth for however long, and yet these people are alive now. There's the touch of Lovecraft to it. There's all kinds of intersections of different creativity and types of horror in just the one story alone. And a fun thing about that day too is that one of Ito's biggest influences and favorite people's is Hideshi Hino. And I will never forget reading that fucking weird book called Hell Baby. I sat there and read the whole damn thing. It was so weird. So while boning up on this and trying to figure out where Ito got his tastes from and what he was influenced by, I was like, oh my God, I've read this. And it's also just cool looking at the other things that you can clearly see how much he reveres his influences too, by Kazuo Umezo, or is that? I'd have to double check. But anyways, it was just really neat going back over some of these things that I had read before when I was so much younger, but now being not only an adult, but in looking at it through the context of this show too, of just being like, oh, this is again really cool, of just a constant reminder to go out there and just consume art, because you never know what's going to strike you and inspire you and move you to make some of your own stuff. And then, before Ito knew it, he started in 1987. By 1999, Tomie had already started being adapted, and it seriously has been adapted like at least a dozen times over or something.
Oh yeah,
It's
people
insane.
love that.
So
People love
yeah,
the
that
stories.
was weirdly enough, again, similar introduction, just even earlier, because I have been again a Japan nerd for about 30 something years now.
So let's give the good people an artistic primer, because again, we're dealing with manga, so essentially a version of comic book art animation. Of course, it's Japanese, so it has the roots, the stylistic roots with anime and traditional manga stylings. You read it from right to left. And there is something different about, and Ito, he does everything. So he not only creates the story, creates the dialogue,
he writes it, storyboards it,
writes
illustrates
it,
it,
comes up with the characters,
illustrates
it. He does everything to get to this final product. But there is, I do want to take just a minute to say there is something different about manga as compared to the Western comic. I feel like not only is it geared towards adults, but I think stylistically, animation wise, there's something so cinematic about it. And I think that's why it more easily is adapted to television, film, things like that, because they are, because you took the words right out of my mouth. They're essentially like storyboards, but you read it like a comic, and that's how. But there is a beauty to even that, because he has the power of the page turn. So when there's this big reveal, this big monster or big elaborate body horror, whatever he wants to show the viewer,
a gigantic plot point, something.
So yeah, you turn the page.
The pacing
and
is very intentional,
and it hits you in the face. And that's what makes it very powerful. And I feel like this medium is special because this is where he really shines. Like it's weird that he picked this of all things. He could have easily gone into television, film, animated films, whatever. But he kind of stayed here through his whole career. And I feel like to his own strength, and from a visual standpoint too, there's two main horror types he likes to deal with, and that is cosmic horror, so like Lovecraft, and body horror, so like Giger and Dolly, things like that. And we see that everywhere in his pieces, to the point where you have to expect the unexpected a lot of the time,
which is very difficult to do with his work as it is. Another thing about the actual aesthetic and style is even within the frame of it being a manga is like American comic books, for instance. First off, they're colorized.
Right.
You'd be kind of
we got black and whites
to try to publish like a black and white comic book without that having some kind of very intentional stylistic information or something to do with what you're trying to get across, and I guess these days things have hit a standard of more basically photorealism, where with especially when even just the regular old frame of American Marvel and DC comics, when you open a book, it doesn't freaking matter. You could literally like grab one with your eyes closed, flip open a page, you will recognize Captain America. You will recognize Batman, etc. Or even if there's a chance that they're not even in like certain like traditional costumes of theirs, there's stylistic things, standards that make it so that it's got a big like explosive approach and that everything is super recognizable. A lot of what Ito did in his work is, again, once again, this is it not only is it black and white, the environments are insanely detailed and yet very plain. Again, it all just takes place in very realistic Japan. This is not in a weird version of like a Marvel Universe version of New York, or a version of an anime world, of other like Japanese type of worlds where things are insanely fantastical. Some of this stuff legitimately is supposed to take place in real cities in Japan, which lends to its just being kind of horrifying of like, this could have been real, because everything about this is real except for the fact that there's this one type of monster. This would never happen. But even beyond that, it's funny that the backgrounds are hyper realistic to an extent. The characters, while sort of attractive, they're also very plain and approachable, to where they're not cartoonish necessarily. Again, a lot of other manga can get very cartoonish and silly. And then especially ones that are more action oriented, like your old school, like Dragon Ball Z and whatever, like other manga that has a lot of action. Again, they will ditch backgrounds or and emphasize certain character details to the point of it just being ridiculous to emphasize certain action and stuff. That's not like the thing here. It's all meant to be insanely engrossing and pull you into the story and get you very, very invested and involved, to where the characters, even though it takes place in Japan, they don't necessarily look super Japanese. They don't look super anime, manga, whatever you want to call it either. It kind of could be like you to an extent. Like, it really just looks like just people, just generic people. And I think that's another aspect that he, seeing the skill that he puts into his illustrations, he could and has sometimes made insanely stylized. I mean, there are things about like somebody who is, looks so monstrous, or somebody who looks so beautiful that this, that, and the other. Aesthetic does play a part in some of his stories, because he likes to balance the horrific and the beautiful. That is a lot of like what he's doing, in that he doesn't quite put a lot of comedy or humor in there, but at the same time, even that is just a normal aspect of life, and you will find that. But I really find it interesting that he treats his characters very, again, like pretty realistically, and yet he leaves them generic enough so that I feel like you can kind of see yourself being the protagonists, these doomed suckers in most of these stories, that where, again, just somebody just finds a thing and all of a sudden everything is fucking bonkers.
Yeah, the detail is off the charts sometimes, like to the point where it's its own piece. Like, that's why so many of I think that's another testament to why he has become so famous over the years and his work has become so prolific, is there can be just stills, people will capture stills, or there'll be the big reveal, the big page turner reveal kind of image that lends itself to being its own piece. And when you actually take the time to look at all the little things he created in the frame, you will gasp at how much attention, how much effort, how much work he has put into every tiny little intricate piece, to again go back to that, not, to your point, not only grounding, but also horrific. We want to make it as close to reality as possible, but also to pull you in, but then also let the pendulum swing all the entire other way, to be like, dear God, how did one person come up with this thing?
Right, to emphasize the disgustingness, the otherworldliness of the aspects of these stories, where yet everything has been insanely standard. It's literally just about like somebody having a hard, week, and they're just coming home, and it turns out their neighbor is made out of like pieces of metal. And then one time, because they cross the line, they start attacking them, and then things just go back to normal, but they keep seeing that person. It's uncanny. It's just so strange. And the fact that he does put such intentional realism in, to the point where I like the fact that one of his stories is actually about, it involves having like, I think it was like 20 rows of teeth or something. And that as a dentist tech, he actually made a point of not doing it how it quote unquote would look if you had 20 rows of teeth, to make it more disgusting and therefore make you even more unsettled. It's all of it's intentional. It's insanely thought out. You can tell. I mean, it's literally the man's life's work. As we've now said, I'm going to just make up a counter, and it could be bullshit 5 times now. The man's been doing this shit for decades. He knows what he's doing.
Exactly. And that's a good segue to start talking about his work. So first, his greatest strength lies in the short story, or what he often calls the one shot. He has written over 100 of these one shots in his career. And now, as we get them in the States and in the West, they're usually collected in anthologies and volumes. To date, he has approximately 6 anthology collections and 26 volumes of his shorts collected for our consumption. The biggest ones being the Junji Ito horror comic collection, Museum of Terror, the Junji Ito story collection, which is, I will say this, after you listen to us and get eventually bored to tears with our ramblings about everything and nothing eventually, and you're like, I should actually check this guy out, this is probably where you're going to see a lot of the stuff in the West. So the Junji Ito story collection includes things like Deserter, Frankenstein, Love Sickness, Smashed, Sochi, and Tombs. And again, it's since it's adapted, obviously it was in Japanese originally, and they had to take out the Japanese figures and put English in them. So it took time to adapt one. So there's really no rhyme and reason to how some of these are organized or collected. Sometimes there are a lot of short stories, sometimes there are just a few. But of course, it depends on it depends on the length of them too, because he also did eventually do long form stories, which we'll talk about some of the biggest ones. Obviously, his magnum opus. We're not going to leave here before talking about A Certain Spiral. Now, I did want to talk about some of the short stories that really stuck up to us. We've already done it. I feel like the reigning champion of his short stories is the Enigma of Amigara Fault. Like, that guy won.
It's so damn good. It's
so damn good.
I love that it has the aspect of nature. Like, it literally, like, there was an earthquake. It's a very common thing in Japan, and they're over there on a fault line and everything. So of course, like, what could be creepier than if the earth sort of burst open a little bit and there were all these people-shaped holes, and it's not that things are going to come out of them, but that, like, things are meant to go into them. And and there's a hole for individual, like, people see theirs and just they can't resist finding it, seeking it out, and then crawling inside. Even the way that this one kind of fakes you out with, like, dream sequence-esque kinds of things too, with like the protagonist dreaming and or at least, like, sort of falling asleep and having these alternate reality, like, extra horrible things help add to the story. So where it also just kind of messes with you of just, like, what is even real in this story outside of the definite consistent thing about these people-shaped holes. Because even just that takes your mind to a where did the holes come from kind of place, of just, like, how long have they been there? How would they have gotten there? What is their actual purpose? Which, like, it's really hard to talk about such a great story and not go into full spoiler mode. So I'm not trying to be as cryptic as possible. I'm genuinely hoping that for something that is still making its way through the West, that if anything, at least a few of his stories will be picked up by you, dear listener.
And I would start there, dear listener. Riles, I'm looking at you. I would start there, and if you are going to Google a few more, some of the other highlights, like ones that really stood out to me, include Hanging Blimp.
Hanging Balloons. Yeah, I was going to say that one.
Hanging. Sometimes it's called Hanging Balloons. The one I found was Hanging Blimps, but I think it's the same story with different
it's just translation
names. Your translation, yeah. And then Honored Ancestors, The Long Dream, and then, of course, some of his long form stories.
Oh, Glyceride, I guess. It's about a restaurant near Mount Fuji. Like I said, he just makes them in real Japan. The restaurant itself is legitimately just covered in grease to where, like, the air is thick. Thick with it. Like, it's so pervasive in the family of, basically, it's like a dad, like, owns and operates this restaurant. She starts, like, the girl main character, a girl named Yui, she starts even having, like, nightmares about like Mount Fuji, like, exploding grease on her, and that, like, and then there's this one really goes into the body horror where there's so much grease everywhere that, like, one of the characters legitimately just is covered in greasy, like, grease-filled pimples and pockets, and he, like, pops his entire face onto her face.
Oh, I do know this story. Yeah. Okay.
It's horrible.
I have read that one. Yeah. There's so many, sometimes it's hard to kind of categorize them. Yeah, categorize them in your mind. Now, he does have three main, of his long form stories and even there, the man isn't without his flaws, where nobody's perfect. I feel like even his long form stories, like Tomie and Uzumaki and Gyo. So Tomie, Uzumaki, Gyo, and to a lesser extent Hellstar Romina or just Romina. They're still kind of collected. The narrative is still collected as if they're one shots. And
Tomie definitely was.
Oh yeah. And I feel like there's no overarching narrative with her pieces. She just kind of pops in and out of stories. Sometimes, like, I won't even expect her to show up, and it's one of those kind of characters where she shows up and just fucking terrorize some guy or whatever the plot point that and I was, do you know the history here? I was actually surprised to understand the history. I thought it was going to be like, some girl broke his heart and now she's going to be like crystallized as a character in his stories forever. It's actually, he gets Tomie from a missing boy story that he grew up with. Someone from like his either, I think he was in grade school or high school or something, and one of his classmates went missing, and then he did a gender swap, and that's how Tomie was born. What if there was a character that, because he went crazy with the idea in his mind of like, he suddenly is just gone, like kind of this, he became obsessed with the idea of this friend of his, or I guess just peer, that suddenly vanished. And he created kind of Tomie around that. This essentially, like when I think of her, I think of like a succubus, like a Western succubus, that cannot die, but she is demonic, and she also kind of an Evil Dead like character that doesn't look like an Evil Dead, a demon, but like it's just unrelenting. They never die. They keep coming back forever.
There's something almost like literally viral about her in that she can make copies and clones of herself. She's like self-reproducing in a weird way. But that also the way that she infects the people around her, because Tomie never kills anybody on by herself. She never actually does the thing. Other people always kill for her, whether it is out of jealousy or if she actually orders them to do it. It's so interesting that just the lore around Tomie alone really helps explain how it was that Ito was able to really trust in himself and really just take it where he felt it needed to go. Like this single character alone is such a neat investment into just reading any kind of cool horror, and especially the fact that it was basically broken down into chapters just over time. And that she does just kind of reappear, like you kind of almost never know what's going to be a Tomie story.
Right. She'll just pop up.
Yeah. And then I think one of my favorite things about it too is in a funny way too, is that like the Tomies fucking hate each other. Actually, I'm sorry.
Like the multiple copies of Tomie?
Yeah. There's at some points, like if a piece of her gets cut off, it can regenerate. And it like,
turns into its own Tomie.
It turns into its own Tomie. And so like, it's such a neat, like, history of that character and how he continued to develop her over time alone. So that one there's a reason that's kind of the flagship, most approachable, the most likely port of entry into the Itoverse.
I also think it's at this point iconic, because when I was talking about the artistic primer of like a lot of his frames, a lot of his like the big reveals or whatever have become their own art pieces, in and of itself. Like people will buy just prints of some of these things, especially because he's gone back to actually give them color. Sometimes he'll actually make more polished versions of his more famous work, and you can buy like prints of that. And at Tomie, I feel like the two-faced piece, there's this reveal of Tomie, this beautiful girl, and then coming out of her is one of her copies, but it's still connected to her face. So you see two faces. You see a beautiful girl's face, and then you see a ghoulish, demonic face connected to her. And that's when you realize, oh, this is not. we're not in Kansas anymore. We're not dealing with just regular shit. We're dealing with a succubus the world's ever seen before. And I feel like that is very iconic. Of all the non readable merch that Ito and his, I guess, management team has put out now, that is the only T-shirt I own is a Tomie T-shirt.
I do also want to emphasize how fucking creepy I at least found the hanging balloons. I like the fact that it borders on the silly, that it really actually is. There's something that almost makes it more horrifying, where there's these like, the story is basically a girl kills herself. She hangs herself. She was basically like a celebrity. Seemingly out of nowhere, she kills herself, and then not only does it cause huge like ripples in the community, but somehow not only do they start seeing her face as a giant balloon of her in the sky, but then all of a sudden other people's faces as giant balloons start showing up, and they all have nooses attached to the bottom of them. And interestingly, it's got that parallel to the Enigma of
Amigara Fault,
where there's like a balloon for everybody. Your balloon is looking for you, and when it finds you, it weirdly like comes at you, snatches you up, and then once you're hung and dead by it, you just float around. Your corpse is just hung by your balloon, but while it's looking for you, these like maliciously playful looks on their faces are so creepy to me. And then there's the fact that they have a thing where like, oh, of course, we'll just pop your own balloon. Anything you do to the balloon happens to you. So you can't just like pop the balloons. And they're basically all constantly hunting their people. It's just fucking weird. And it's its own kind of terrifying. Because then of course you can't go outside, and then people start to be like, well, great, we're going to starve, because if I try to get food, of course, like I'm going to have to go outside, and my
that's
balloon
the
is going to
beauty
come
of
for me.
Ito, though, is because after you read enough of his stories, you'll read something like that and you'll be like, that's such an Ito story. He's created such an identity for what he likes to write and make too, that when you read something like that, you're like, yep, that's on brand. That
checks out.
works out. That checks out. Now we can't get out of here without talking about Uzumaki, arguably his magnum opus. And for this show, I read the whole B. This is one that's been on my bucket list, and when we finally scheduled our Halloween special to be focused on Mr. Ito, I was like, well, this is fucking it. I gotta read this whole thing, and it is. I get it. Like I said, it's not without its flaws. It's very, the narrative has some pacing issues, but when I got done with Uzumaki, I realized, so for the good people, we've talked about this before, but just to give you guys a quick synopsis on the basic premise of the story. So there is a town that is cursed, and that curse takes the shape of a spiral, and that spiral suddenly appears everywhere. You see spirals in the ocean. You see spirals essentially everywhere. People become obsessed with spirals. People become spirals. Use your imagination. It like the sky is the limit on how this.
It's like possession, but it's not just a demon. It's legitimately the concept of spirals somehow possesses an entire area.
And the narrative tries to explain why. We eventually see why this particular area is cursed and why it's cursed with spirals. But from there, so every great writer or artist, they start with a basic premise and idea. And that's all you guys really need to know, is that this town is cursed, and that curse takes the shape of spirals. But from there, he essentially, I would call it a series of one-shots that does have a connective tissue. There is characters we see in almost every single story. But every story, every chapter is like its own contained story, right? Like a traditional one-shot where it has its own narrative within side of the chapter. And I will say this. This is the first time, I think, why it's considered as magnum opus, and why people always point to like, oh, you got to read, if you get into Ito, you got to read Uzumaki, is because it to some of our primer points of it, his work not only gets under your skin or makes your skin crawl, but I walked away feeling almost a little disturbed. Like, this was the first time it became almost so realistic, even though I knew I was still reading this manga. It became so realistic that I was a little disturbed after finishing chapters. There is a chapter called Mosquitoes that will live with you for fucking ever.
Funny enough, I actually watched a live action adaptation years ago. Like I
that didn't quite land from how I understand it.
Well, because it's going to look goofy because it is just, and it also just CG wasn't what it was supposed to be back when it was made like almost 20 years ago. Which, hey, again, just to put some frame of reference on this, Uzumaki first started becoming published in like 1998. Like it's fucking nearly 30 years old. So it's yeah. I mean, like, and also to piggyback on what you were saying a moment ago, Novo, is that this is put out like a monthly or serialized thing. This was put out basically like a chapter at a time. I think part of it is the fact that because he is a one-man powerhouse, it takes time to make art that's that good, that is that faithful, and that he is doing pretty much all of it by himself. Again, writing, plotting, illustrating, and then all of that stuff. I mean, legitimately, it's crazy
And
what
it
all
was
he
clear to me
accomplishes.
that I think part of it he was kind of figuring out as he was going to. He didn't know how he wanted to string some of these stories together. But like once he had that premise, he was like, "Oh, well, I can have a story about this and I can have a story about that." And you see that like all of his chapters are like that. Like what's if this happened? What's if that happened?
I like to think that, especially with the way that the way it was serialized and the fact that it was so ongoing, and the fact that a spiral is a very normal and naturally occurring shape/pattern, that I think in a way it was literally him trying to work something out, and that he himself probably almost felt compelled, if not like almost possessed by the fact that like, again, like this thing, like this concept won't leave me alone. And that's why I feel like that has to be true.
That's a very good theory because the very first chapter, we see the father of the main character, the main protagonist. Well, there's two protagonists. There's a male and female love interest, but the father of said male protagonist goes crazy with Spiral. So we see. So this is also a tale of people going mad with the curse, with the concept of the spiral, and we see that with the protagonist's father. And I could see that being Ito, him being like, "This is kind of me. I'm going to put myself in the story in a way."
Yeah, and I mean, funny enough, he's very self-aware. I mean, and he's written like one of the other things, which
He puts
I'm
himself in
sure,
his stuff all the time.
yeah,
which is funny.
It's yeah, like some of the stuff that I read, he would illustrate himself as like a afterword of just like, oh, thanks for reading this book. And it's hilarious
Yes.
seeing his version of himself on the page. And then if you ever go actually watch an interview with him, see pictures of him and read about his just normal life, you're like,
And
he
he's
is
so
just such an
humble.
everyday, average seeming dude. And it's just so interesting to see these different aspects of him and just how demented his mind can be when he wants to sit down and make like a wild story.
Right.
So it's very interesting. But yeah, I kind of feel like Uzumaki legitimately, in a weird way, possessed him back. And that's why he was so taken by it, and why it is such a powerful work of his. I think it kind of went both ways.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I feel like for all you guys listening that are maybe getting into or considering now getting into Ito's work, don't start here. Start with a few of the short stories and then work your way up.
I think it's Toontown, maybe. I liked that one. The one where it's so cool. It's where basically there's a town where if you die in it, you start to turn into your own tombstone. Like where you die, you just begin to plant into the ground.
I just read that like I think a week or two ago.
That one has some amazing like creature design kind of shit to it. I love that one. Was so cool because again, I love how it all just starts with really simple mysteries. It's just like, oh, this is just a brother and sister on vacation, and all of a sudden they're in a town where they're just like, oh yeah, this is just what happens to people around here. And then as they explore that, it's just the shit. Again, once again, shit just goes off the rails. And that there's a really neat one about like basically what practically could be like an old one or something, but there's just some weird eldritch shit washes up on the shore. And it's full of what was thought to be like missing sailors.
People. There's people in it. They're still alive when they cut them out.
Kind of, yeah. It's like there's amazing one shots. So there's certain things that are a bigger investment of your time, but to dip your toes in, luckily there's almost nothing more primed to be like, hey, here's a buttload of one shots of varying length. Knock yourselves
they're
out.
Quick and easy too.
Yeah,
like you can. The
pacing is insane. That's another. I really think that's another. It's harder to appreciate, but I especially in horror, with any storytelling, of course, pacing is important, but especially with not only horror but a manga. Again, a thing like this is where, like an actual page turner that is part visual, part textual. The pacing that he has just discovered, his whatever like method, I don't know how he does it, but his pacing is, I don't want to say unparalleled, but it stands. It is
so
a
cinematic.
huge part of his art. It's
so
hard to quantify.
Manga and comics.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, because otherwise, like a lot of other comic stuff, it really just is about like the big action and focusing on these characters that have also been serialized for like 50, 60 years, possibly. These are one shots. These people are mostly doomed. They're usually going to die.
And you never see them again.
So it doesn't matter. Tomie, so it's all about making sure that the story hits correctly. So I really want to emphasize the amazing co-star of his that is the pacing that he is able to establish is part of what just makes his stories so damn readable and just engaging and addictive.
And the other long-form stories to check out once you get into him,
once you realize how fucking great he is,
yep. And this another such a creative story. So it's essentially like different sea creatures and a lot of different animals become like kind of almost sentient from a bacterial stench, I believe, is the main premise of the story. And like fish grow legs, like spider legs, and terrorize humans for most of the story, which is very similar to Ramina or Hellstar Ramina, which is I feel like this is the most Lovecraftian thing he's ever written. Is we literally have a giant creature in the shape of what looks like a planet, but the planet can consume other planets and people, like full civilizations and stuff like that. But then there's a very, again, familial, there's something so grounded about his work. I feel like we're going back to that over and over again. Very familial. Our cultures are similar. Our cultures, Japanese and Americans, are dramatically different, but there is a lot of overlap, like baseball. But besides that, I think we can, even though these stories are so Japanese, with, to Philip's point about sometimes the uses of the cultural staples, the use of spirits and ghosts, and kind of what we talked about in our Studio Ghibli piece, where a lot of these characters just talk about things that are very fantastical to us as if they're just everyday occurrences, and it's like, oh, that spirit, oh, that's where that spirit lives. Of course,
like,
kind of thing.
That's where some kids got murdered, and they come back out of the wall every so often.
Yeah, it's so there's a lot of like there's an understanding to how the Japanese write some of their cultural fairy tales and fantastical pieces, and we see that here time and time again. But the point is that regardless, you're gonna relate to it. I feel like any culture can. I used America because we're Americans and we're in America.
Wait, you're American?
But you Brits, you kids in the UK. That was more Australian. It was Australia. Bottle-o. Yeah, I feel like the point is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you come from. You are going to. It's going to feel comfortable. It's going to feel familial. It's going to feel very relatable.
I would say relatable it's pretty key there.
Other works before we get out of here. So he does have a lot of other auxiliary work out there. Auxiliary work includes Black Paradox, A Diary of Embellished Patches, Dissolving Classroom, Fragments of Horror, also known as The Shard of Evil, Junji Ito's Cat Diary, Yan and Mu, The Liminal Zone, just picked that. That was the last thing I picked up. Mimi's Tales of Terror, also known as Mimi's Ghost Stories, No Longer Human, Rasputin the Patriot, Censor, also known as Travelogue of the Succubus, Venus in the Blind Spot, Voices in the Dark, New Voices in the Dark. He also has been commissioned for illustration. So, like all you nerds, I know you have either played or heard of Magic: The Gathering. He has done card artwork for that franchise, album artwork, and of course concept art for video games. That's what we talked about PT in the introduction.
Also, one of the awards that he won was for his adaptation of Frankenstein.
I actually bought that one too. I have that short story his version is a short story. I bought that manga, and it's excellent. It's a really nice adaptation. Film, television, and video game adaptations include, of course, a ton of stuff with Tomie, The Fearsome Melody, Uzumaki in 2000, live action one that didn't quite land. Gravetown, The Face Burglar, The Hanging Balloons, as we already talked about, Long Dream, Partition, Scarecrow, Love Ghost,
Maronier,
The Groaning Drain, Tales of the Bizarre, the Junji Collection, Maniac, Japanese Tales of the Macabre. So this is one, guys, you can find on Netflix. So, and then of course the Uzumaki manga adaptation that is supposed to be so faithful. Like it is jarringly faithful to the source material, and to be determined or to be announced, Bloodsucking Darkness. And then another thing that I own that I urge you guys to get into if you're like, because I'm one of those people that, I love the collection of like kind of coffee table art books where it's just like, it's just like essentially stills or what would be, either paintings in a museum or their prints, and just like collected into a volume, some sort of like coffee book. His book, it's literally called The Art of Junji Ito Twisted Visions. I own that guy. It's actually right in front of me. And his pieces become, or some of his frames become pieces in the manga, like some of his big reveals and things like that. This is essentially a collection of it. I can't recommend it enough. It is, if you just like to flip through the art of something, this is one to buy. Other special art exhibition pieces or uncollected one-shots include Demon's Voice, Ghost Type Management Association, Junji Ito Snow White, Layers of Fear, Mountain of Gods, Precipice of the Unknown, Mr. Inagawa's Ghost Story Treasure Box, Mystery Pavilion, Return of the Hanging Balloons, She is a Slow Walker, Sochi Possessed, The Summertime Graduation Trip, and other Tomie tales. So let's help the good people. Let's tie a bow on this bee and try to summarize why Junji Ito was so special. Why? Remember at the beginning of the show, at the top of the show, I said there is something. There's a special sauce. There's something I can't quite put my finger on. Let's try to put our finger on that pulse.
It's all very approachable. It's looking for the mundane and making it not so mundane. And the amount of work that he's produced with that, which not that all of his work encompasses or showcases that specific quality. And some of it is more serialized and some of it is far more fantastic than mundane necessarily, but it's very present in a lot of it. So it's, as we've said earlier, insanely approachable. There's also the fact that his works vary in length, very much. So where, again, you've got so many one-shots, but also longer form things that will actually take you a bit of a sit down to page through, but you'll also flip through those pages probably pretty damn quick. Whether body horror is or isn't your thing, there's a story in there for you. If you like H.P. Lovecraft, there's a story in there for you. If you like ghosts, if you like demon type stuff, if you just like strange coincidences, there's just such breadth to so much of what he has spent years, decades doing now, to where it's hard not to find something to enjoy. And whether you end up loving it, liking it, whatever, it's kind of undeniable that the man has got a talent, and that it makes a lot of sense why he's become so widely recognized for just being such the prolific creator that he is, of just all the nooks and crannies of what can be truly horrible.
I want to piggyback on something, and his kind of horror is also what we now call elevated horror, because it is very relatable. It deals with the personal, it deals with the familial. And so I would say that Junji Ito was elevated horror before we even were calling it elevated horror.
I would agree. Absolutely. He's been doing this so long that I doubt this was called this in the 90s.
I feel like the first time they were calling it was like the Babadook. Like this is about her depression, where I feel like there's a lot of that kind of stuff in his work.
Interestingly enough, funny, I'm glad you said that, because it does remind me of something. Of all the things that happen and of all the seemingly insane things that people decide to do in some of the stories, granted, you could almost say that it's because, for instance, like, oh, they were possessed by some sort of force, or that Tomie used whatever charm it is that she has to make somebody. He actually never plays on true weakness, which I actually think is another reason why it's very enjoyable. That it's not just it's never just left up to like, oh, they're just crazy, they're just having a bad day. It's like, no, this is a shared experience. Like this shit was very real, and because of that, I feel like that's another part of why it's elevated, because it's not just more cheap thrills. It's not just the same like, ooh, a zombie, he's going to kill so many people and then get shot in the head, and just there's nothing that's predictable about it. It's all incredibly novel, and yet very respectful, and yet also divergent from the norm. Again, it's not, while it's all very Japanese, there are no recognizable, there's no kappa, there's no weird turtle demon that's going to drown you in the bowl of water on its head. It's all so obviously
it'll be
inspired.
A snail demon,
right? It's also
I've noticed he must have a fear of snails. I feel like he adds snails into almost all of his horrific work.
They're very present. Again, there's just something very odd about them, for sure. You could definitely call them unsettling.
Snails and Uzumaki, snail people.
There are so many themes that are not your typical throwaway horror. So the amount that he's been able to create while not treading on almost any familiar ground and also not feeling like he's besmirching anything that you love or care about. He's just done such a fantastic job of carving out an entire universe of horror, all on his own. But that it's, like I said, it's all still interestingly like approachable, because there's never like, even that was a thing that I feel like he loved about Lovecraft probably, and then decided to go other direction, because so many of Lovecraft's tales are just like, who knows what old, Richards could have been mad. He was a madman. Like, what he saw drove him mad. Like, it's not about that. It's
like
weirdly,
your madman voice.
Yeah, that was the Lovecraft voice. He's been driven mad. But yeah, I like that the influences are there. Yeah. And that the intersection of all of his things, that, again, like the Japaneseness, his specific influences, and the things that he obviously found motivating enough to create art about, is still so insanely unique, yet still not too unique to not be just super picked up and just plowed through as far as books go.
And there you have it. The works, the career, the horror of Junji Ito. Guys, thank you so much for listening. I want to thank you. I want to thank our guest, Mr. Philip Church of philipchurch.com.
Oh, stop.
But before we go, we got a little extra for you, a little icing on the cake, a little cherry on top with what we call the gem of the week. Before we talk gems, guys, let's talk sponsors. Today's gems are brought to you by Zencastr. Zencastr is our go-to tool for remote podcast recordings. What's great is that you can record separate audio and video tracks, and it's all backed up on a secured cloud, so you never lose your hard work. Even better, it's easy to use, and there's nothing to download. So go to Zencastr.com and use promo code Art of the Beholder and get 30% off your first 3 months with the Pro account. Now back to the gems. Mine are short and sweet, so we can get out of here and eat our candy. And I'm going in the completely opposite direction. I got 2 albums for you, Philip.
Ooh.
That is Brittany Howard's What Now? And Hooray for the Riff Raff. The past is still alive. The country, country is really trying to make a comeback. Sometimes really well. Sometimes, dear God, if I hear another pop country song, I'm going to kill myself.
I somehow am able to avoid that completely, so I'm sorry for what you're going through.
Well, the Hooray for the Riff Raff album is a country album, but it's like it's good, soulful old school country. So
okay,
it was good.
Back when country was good.
Yeah,
gotcha. Yeah. Mine's a bit of a throwback. Are you familiar with Coconut Records?
Coconut Records? No, tell us.
Interestingly, the second I knew this about it, I was like, no shit, this sounds familiar. It's Jason Schwartzman, the actor. He actually used to be like really big into music and played in bands and stuff out in LA. And then at one point, a band he was in broke up, and he just started calling what he was producing. He just was like, I'm Coconut Records. And so I'd be surprised if everybody who decides to check that out doesn't realize, like, oh my gosh, you're right, I've heard this song before. He's a surprisingly talented musician. I don't mean that in any kind of mean way. It's so interesting when people are multi-talented, but their talent isn't. As a known actor, you'd think that most of what he does was like focusing, on his acting career. But I really get this sense from, he's like helped do like film scores and stuff. So actually, surprisingly talented musician as well. But 1 or 2 of the albums under Coconut Records that aren't like film scores are just very fun, listenable, just good old sort of indie rock, basically, or like indie alternative. It's not exactly rock, but it's basically just worth a listen. Just go do it.
Just go do it. And if you like that, you can always check us out at novadayproductions.com. If you want to get a hold of Philip, how do they do it?
philipchurch.com. That's Philip with 1 L. I do have social media. I'm pretty sure it's Philip Church Pro VO Nerd, but all that's going to probably do is show you the same stuff on my website, and it's better on a good old computer. So philipchurch.com. That's where you can see my demos, my samples, and reach out to me if you would like to collaborate on something.
Guys, reach out.
It'll drive you mad.
Drive you mad. You get that voice.
I had to.
You can always follow us at _Novo_day, and day is DE, and at AOTB.podcast and at AOTB podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, do all the things, rate, review. And if you'd like to sponsor a little love child or be on the show, you can reach out to us at novadayproductions@gmail.com. So until next time, be good to each other. And we'll see you in the next one. But until then, as always, good luck and Godspeed.
To each other. Sorry.
Ooh, we love you.
Art of the Beholder is brought to you by Novo Day Productions. Created and hosted by Novo Day and the Novo Day Collective. Facebook.com/Novo Day Media, @Novo Day Media on Twitter and Instagram. Music by A Company. Facebook.com/ACOMusic123. ACO on Spotify. Logo design by Tom Justice, JESTUS, of thejusticecompany.com. All rights reserved.